Let's talk about Rebecca because I finished it a few days ago. Should have talked about it sooner, but it's been the holidays. Happy holidays, by the way, if you celebrate Christmas or not. Hope you're having a good time. But let's talk about some Daphne du Maurier. This was actually my introduction to Daphne du Maurier. I don't know why, at the ripe old age of 21, I haven't started reading her books yet because she's fabulous. Like, even the afterword where they were talking all about her life, I was like, oh, is there a movie about you? Because you just seem like a fabulous person. But, anyways, Rebecca, spoiler alert, the first half of this book and some of the end is just Jane Eyre. It's just Jane Eyre. And then the second half is a little bit of Brothers Karamazov, but not enough Brothers Karamazov, in my opinion. I wish it was more. And I don't say that to be dismissive because I do really like this book. However, I don't know. I don't know if my feelings are fully realized yet about it. I can see why it's such a classic. Like, it was haunting. I mean, it's one of these books where it manages to scare you so much by doing so little. And I wish modern horror writers would take a leaf out of her book because sometimes modern horror is a bit of a maximalist sort of thing where they really try and push you to the edge because you're so desensitized to it. But this book, I guess because it's gothic horror, it's all in the ambience. It's not so much that the characters are saying or doing things that are scary. It's just the vibes. You're like, I have goosebumps. This is very tense. And it's tense throughout. Like, it never really abates. So the main character is this 21-year-old girl. We never get her first name. She decides to sort of leave her ward in Monte Carlo and marry this man who is double her age. So he's 42, she's 21. I suppose we should be grateful that their relationship isn't really a physical one. And in that sense, it's different to Jane Eyre because in Jane Eyre, she doesn't start as his wife, she starts as his governess, and then he falls in love with her, Mr. Rochester. Whereas in this case, Mr. De Winter, they're together from the start, but there's this constant shadow of like his former wife who died tragically, and she keeps feeling like she doesn't hold a candle to her. I did like the sort of rhetoric of how women are constantly expected to like compare themselves to one another. I think this is a really good pro-feminist book. And I do like how polarizing your POV could be because there's two sides to it. You can support Rebecca and you can also support Mrs. De Winter, even though they're conflicting, they both have sort of compelling arguments for them, and I like that. Another major presence in this book is Manderley. So Manderley is this rich estate in Cornwall, and much like Mrs. De Winter, we're very much in awe of it because it's this huge, amazing place full of beauty, although a lot of the beauty was put there by Rebecca. So again, there's that constant feeling of inferiority. And a part of me did get a bit frustrated by the repetitiveness of that. I almost wanted to sort of like lean into the book and give Mrs. De Winter a shake and be like, don't worry about Rebecca. But yes, I see the significance of that. I've always been quite funny about Cornwall because if you didn't know, Cornwall has an above average background radiation. So the whole time I'm reading this, I know it's so silly, but in my mind I'm like, oh no, Mrs. De Winter, get out of there. Never mind the ghosts. You're going to get breast cancer and your hair's going to fall out. Stay away from Cornwall. There's too much background radiation. Maybe it wasn't there back then. This does take place in the 30s, which is a weird time period for this kind of book because a lot of the attitudes feel very dated. It's almost Victorian in the way that they still think about a lot of stuff. But then they also have cars and telephones. So it's an interesting transitional period where people are starting to be a bit more progressive but are also still kind of dated. I'm interested if there's any more classics in this sort of time range. The book really takes a turn when they recover the boat, Rebecca's old boat that she used to go out onto like the sea with. they find it at the bottom of the sea and they find her body in there, and it doesn't make sense because Rebecca has already been buried, so they don't know who this body is. And then that's when Mr. De Winter, Maximilian, he just casually says to the second Mrs. De Winter, our main character, he's just like, yeah, I killed Rebecca. Spoiler alert. I mean, it knocked me for six. It was a real twist. I was like, oh, oh, he killed her. It suddenly got very Bluebeard. I was like, oh, he wasn't letting her in the West Wing. It's because he's got all the dead wives in there. I was like, oh, oh. I fully was, because normally I'm really good at predicting book twists because I read enough books that I can sort of understand the thought process behind the writer making certain decisions. This I couldn't predict at all. I was like, oh, I honestly thought that the dead body in the boat was going to be Mrs. Danvers, the maid. Because can we talk about Mrs. Danvers? Because if you've murdered your wife, why would you still keep her closest assistant in employment? You wouldn't. I don't really understand the logic behind that. Like, if I'm killing my wife, her best friend is not staying on the estate. Like, Mrs. Danvers, I'm sorry, it's been great having you work for us all these years, but you're gone. Like, we don't need you anymore. We'll get a new maid. So I don't really understand why he still kept her around, especially since, spoiler alert, she burns down Manderley at the end. That's when it got even more Jane Eyre. But still, like, there's no way you would keep her in employment. And it frustrated me that even when she was giving Mrs. De Winter a hard time, because she's this meek 21-year-old, she never goes to her husband and is like, can we get Mrs. Danvers fired? She just threatened to push me out a window. Like, can we get her fired? You know? Like, you wouldn't put up with it. You'd be like, Mrs. Danvers, get rid, kick rocks, you're out. But I digress. This is where it gets really Brothers Karamazov, because the sort of last 150 pages are all about the investigation into how Rebecca really died, because we sort of find out Rebecca told Mr. De Winter that she was pregnant with another man's child and that she was going to raise it and pretend that it was his child when only those two knew the truth. So he shot her, put her on the boat, sabotaged the boat so that it would fill up with water and it would look like she drowned. I fundamentally didn't understand, and I thought it was a missed opportunity, was that there's Ben. So Ben is from one of the local families, and he's this guy with, I think he has Down syndrome. I probably should have looked into it. I didn't appreciate that the book kept referring to him as an idiot, but different times, sure. Ben witnesses the whole thing. He witnesses Mr. De Winter ruining the boat so that Rebecca's dead body would drown in the sea. So he's very much the linchpin for the whole thing, but he just denies it and then it's never brought up again. And I found that really strange because that's very, not Crime Punishment, that's very Brothers Karamazov. Ben is basically Smerdyakov, who, if you haven't read Brothers Karamazov, he's the one who pretends to have an epileptic seizure so that he can go and kill Fyodor Pavlovich. And so it felt very similar. And I was just so surprised that the whole case is really predicated on him, but it never really comes out. Like, they're just fine with the De Winters getting away with it. I don't know. I thought, missed opportunity. I'd love to see someone do, like, a modern version of this. Like, in the same way that Jean Rhys wrote Wide Sargasso Sea to expand the story of Jane Eyre and tell it from the other side. I would love someone to do that with this. Like, maybe it's time for, like, a postmodern Rebecca rewrite. Like, that would be so cool. But yes, that was Rebecca. Fabulous, gothy, spooky classic. And I love Daphne du Maurier's writing.